Hey guys, tonight we are going somewhere that will make your heated bedroom feel like a 5-star tropical resort. We are going to Yakutia, a vast, bone-crushing, soul-testing region in northeastern Siberia where the cold does not just bite, it swallows you whole, digests you slowly, and spits out whatever is left sometime around April. Tonight, you are going to live a full winter night in one of the most extreme environments ever to host human civilization, curled up in a house that never quite gets warm, in a landscape where the air itself becomes your enemy the moment you step outside. You probably will not survive this. Statistically speaking, most outsiders who underestimate Yakutia do not make it through their first unsupported winter, and we are not talking about dramatic polar explorer deaths here. We are talking about stepping outside for 5 minutes without the right gear and losing fingers you were genuinely quite fond of. So tonight, you get to experience all of that from the safety of wherever you are lying right now, which is almost certainly warmer than anything we are about to describe. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you are in the world right now and what time it is locally. I love picturing all of you spread out across the planet, some of you in summer heat, some of you in a chilly autumn bedroom, all of you about to drift off to the sound of Siberian winter. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of something incomprehensible, not metaphorically, literally standing at the geographic and meteorological edge of what human physiology can tolerate without mechanical assistance. Yakutia, officially known as the Sakha Republic, occupies roughly 3 million square kilometers of northeastern Russia, making it the largest federal subject of any country on Earth. To put that in perspective, it is larger than Argentina, larger than India, larger than the entire continent of Australia if you squint at the numbers a little generously. And across almost all of that vast, humbling territory, winter reigns for the better part of 8 or 9 months every single year. The Sakha Republic sits so far north and so deep into the continental interior of Asia that it experiences what climatologists call extreme continentality, a condition where the ocean's moderating influence is essentially non-existent. No warm Atlantic currents creeping up to soften the edges. No maritime breeze drifting in to remind the landscape that warmth exists somewhere in the universe. Just the raw, unmediated brutality of a landmass cooling itself down to temperatures that should, by any reasonable measure, make permanent human settlement impossible. And yet people have lived here for thousands of years. That fact alone should be enough to keep you awake in sheer bewilderment. Though tonight, we are aiming for the opposite effect, so let us ease into it slowly. The numbers, when you first encounter them, read like a misprint. The town of Oymyakon, nestled in the Oymyakon Valley roughly 900 kilometers northeast of Yakutsk, holds the verified record for the lowest temperature ever recorded in a permanently inhabited settlement on Earth. On the 2nd of February, 1933, a Soviet meteorologist named Sergei Oberchev recorded a temperature of minus 67.7 degrees Celsius at the local weather station. Some accounts, drawing on earlier and less rigorously standardized measurements, push that figure even further, to minus 71.2 degrees Celsius, a number so extreme that it starts to lose meaning without sensory context. Like being told a star is very far away and trying to feel the distance in your chest. Let us try to give that number a body. At minus 40 degrees Celsius, which is also minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit because the two scales happen to converge at that particular act of cosmic cruelty, your exhaled breath freezes before it has fully left your mouth, producing a soft crackling sound that locals call the whisper of the stars. Your eyelashes accumulate frost within seconds of stepping outside. Any exposed skin begins to experience the first stages of frostbite within 2 or 3 minutes. Metal becomes brittle. Rubber shatters. Diesel fuel gels in its tank. Car batteries die so quickly that most Oymyakon residents never turn their engines off during winter. They simply let them idle for months at a time, burning fuel continuously because the alternative is an engine block that has become, essentially, decorative sculpture. Now double that cold. Push past minus 50, past minus 60, toward that minus 71 figure. At those temperatures, the physics of the world start behaving in ways that feel more like folklore than science. Boiling water thrown into the air vaporizes instantly, exploding into a cloud of ice crystals before a single drop can fall to the ground. This is not a party trick. It is a demonstration of sublimation so rapid it is almost violent. Your saliva freezes on your tongue. Your breath does not just mist. It crackles audibly as the moisture crystallizes mid-air. Trees, Siberian larch trees, which are among the hardiest plants on the planet, occasionally explode. The sap inside them freezes and expands until the wood can no longer contain the pressure, and the forest produces a sound like distant gunfire on the coldest nights. Historians still argue whether the -71 measurement from Oymyakon represents a true meteorological reading or a figure that crept upward through decades of regional pride and imprecise early Soviet instrumentation. But nobody seriously disputes that temperatures in this valley routinely plunge past -60, and that is extreme enough to make the debate feel a little academic. Yakutia's geography conspires to create this cold in ways that feel almost deliberate. The region sits in a topographic bowl. The Oymyakon Valley is literally surrounded by mountain ranges on multiple sides, which traps cold, dense air the way a cupped hand holds water. Cold air is heavier than warm air, so it sinks and pools in low-lying valleys, creating what meteorologists call a temperature inversion. During winter, the valley floor can be 30 or 40 degrees colder than the ridgelines above it. This means that if you were to climb the hills surrounding Oymyakon on the coldest January night, you would actually get warmer as you ascended. The mountain tops are the warm part. The village is the freezer. Someone designed this landscape specifically to confound human intuition, and they did an excellent job. The Yana River, the Indigirka River, and the Kolyma River all thread their way through this frozen territory, and in winter they become not rivers but roads. Literally. Locals drive trucks across the frozen Lena River, which can reach a thickness of several meters of solid ice by midwinter, capable of supporting not just cars, but fully laden cargo vehicles. The roads across river ice are called zimniki, winter roads, and they represent one of the more peculiar features of life in a place where the ground itself is the most reliable solid surface available. In summer, the thawed upper layer of permafrost turns parts of Yakutia into a boggy, impassable swamp. In winter, everything freezes solid and the landscape paradoxically becomes easier to traverse. Winter is not the enemy of movement here, it is the precondition for it. The permafrost itself deserves a moment of quiet reverence. Beneath your feet, if you were standing anywhere in Yakutia right now, lies a layer of permanently frozen ground that, in some places, reaches down 1,500 meters. 1.5 kilometers of frozen earth, compressed and ancient, containing within it the preserved remains of woolly mammoths that died tens of thousands of years ago in conditions almost identical to those above ground today. Yakutia has yielded some of the most extraordinarily preserved megafauna specimens ever found. Not just bones but skin, fur, stomach contents, eyelashes. A baby mammoth nicknamed Luba, discovered in a tributary of the Uribe River in 2007, was so perfectly preserved by the permafrost that researchers could analyze her last meal. She had died somewhere between 41,000 and 42,000 years ago and looked, reportedly, like she had simply lain down for a nap. The cold does not just preserve things. It defines everything: the architecture, the agriculture, the economy, the culture, the daily schedule, the relationship between the human body and the concept of comfort. There is no casual relationship with cold in Yakutia. No one steps outside in Oymyakon in January to get a bit of fresh air and clear their head. Every interaction with the outdoor world is a calculated negotiation between what you need to accomplish and how long your body can tolerate the terms. And then there are the people. The Saka people, also called Yakuts, the Turkic-speaking indigenous group who have called this region home for somewhere between 300 and 1,000 years depending on which migration theory you find most persuasive, did not stumble into this environment accidentally and fail to leave. They adapted, completely, ingeniously, and in ways that still leave researchers quietly astonished when they examine the depth of traditional knowledge embedded in Saka survival practices. We will spend much of this night exploring exactly how that adaptation worked, and works still, but for now, let the foundational reality settle over you like a heavy blanket. Outside the window of every home in Oymyakon tonight, if it is winter, the temperature is doing something to the air that requires a new vocabulary to describe. The cold is not a sensation there so much as a presence. A physical force with density and intention, pressing against every surface, searching for gaps in insulation, creeping through door frames, turning window glass opaque with interior frost. The night sky above Oymyakon in winter is spectacular in the way that things are spectacular when they are completely indifferent to your survival, vast, impossibly clear, ablaze with stars that seem closer than they should because there is not a molecule of humidity left in the air to soften their light. The aurora borealis appears with regularity, draping curtains of green and violet across the dark, which is beautiful and ancient and utterly unbothered by the fact that you would be dead in 20 minutes without the right coat. You are not there tonight, though. You are here, in your warm room, with your regulated temperature and your soft bedding and your complete freedom from the whisper of the stars. And we are going to ease through the story of what it means to live, to build, to sleep, and to survive in the coldest inhabited place on Earth, one slow, drowsy section at a time. Pull the blanket up just a little. You will not need it for warmth, but the weight feels right for where we are going. Yakutsk sits on the western bank of the Lena River like a city that arrived by accident and then stubbornly refused to leave. It is the capital of the Sakha Republic, home to roughly 300,000 people, and it holds the distinction of being the coldest city of its size anywhere on the planet, a title that appears in tourism brochures with the kind of cheerful resignation that only comes from having processed the information over several generations and decided to lean into it. The city's average January temperature hovers around -40 degrees Celsius. Not the record low, the average, the typical Tuesday in January. The weather that residents describe with a shrug and the Yakut equivalent of bit nippy out. To understand why a city exists here at all, you have to go back to 1632, when a Cossack military detachment led by Pyotr Beketov established a winter fort, an ostrog, on the banks of the Lena River. The Russians were pushing east with remarkable speed and remarkable disregard for geography, claiming territory across Siberia in a colonial expansion that was partly driven by the fur trade, which in the 17th century was essentially the oil industry of its era. Sable fur, in particular, was so valuable in European and Asian markets that it functioned as a form of currency, and Siberia was full of sable. The fact that Siberia was also full of lethal cold was, from the perspective of Moscow, a secondary consideration. The Cossacks who founded Yakutsk were not idealists or adventurers in the romantic sense. They were pragmatic, often brutal agents of imperial expansion who built forts where the geography was defensible, the rivers were navigable, and the indigenous population could be taxed in furs. The Sakha people who already lived in the region were subjected to yasak, a fur tribute demanded by the Russian state, and the relationship between the newcomers and the existing inhabitants was, as these colonial relationships tend to be, complicated, extractive, and frequently violent. Historians still argue whether the early Russian presence in Yakutia represented a military conquest in any meaningful sense or a more gradual process of administrative absorption, given that the Russian forces were often dramatically outnumbered and logistically stretched to the point of absurdity. What is not disputed is that the fort became a town, the town became a city, and the city became the administrative center of a region that the Russian Empire found useful, then the Soviet Union found ideologically significant, and that modern Russia maintains with a mixture of strategic interest and logistical bewilderment. Yakutsk grew because rivers grow cities. The Lena was a highway into the interior, a route for goods and people, and the long arm of distant governments. And because wherever humans plant a flag and build a structure, other humans tend to accumulate. The first problem with building in Yakutia, which presents itself immediately and never goes away, is the permafrost. You already know about the permafrost from our time in Section 1, that vast, ancient layer of frozen ground stretching down 1,500 meters in places, but now we need to think about what it means for construction specifically. The issue is deceptively simple and structurally catastrophic. Permafrost is stable as long as it stays frozen. The moment you introduce heat, the heat of a building, the heat of pipes running underground, the heat generated by the simple fact of human occupation, the permafrost immediately below and around the structure begins to thaw. And thawing permafrost does not just get soft. It becomes liquid. The ice within the soil melts, the ground loses its structural integrity, and anything sitting on top of it begins to sink, tilt, shift, and eventually collapse. This is not a theoretical risk. Walk through the older parts of Yakutsk and you will see it happening in real time. Buildings leaning at angles that would concern a visitor, but that residents have learned to read the way sailors read waves, with a practiced eye for which lean is cosmetic and which lean is structural emergency. Soviet-era apartment blocks stand at gentle but unmistakable tilts. Roads develop sinkholes and undulations that give driving through certain neighborhoods the quality of a mild fairground ride. Trees lean in multiple directions simultaneously, creating what geologists call a drunken forest. An eerie, disorienting landscape where nothing stands perpendicular to the ground because the ground itself has become a slow, cold liquid. The solution that Yakutian builders eventually arrived at, after several expensive and sometimes fatal lessons in what happens when you ignore permafrost, was elegant in its simplicity and striking in its visual effect. You must lift the building off the ground entirely. Every modern structure of any permanence in Yakutsk stands on stilts, thick concrete or metal piles driven deep into the permafrost, past the unstable active layer near the surface, down into the frozen substrate below. The building sits above the ground with a gap, sometimes half a meter, sometimes a full meter or more, between the floor and the earth beneath it. Cold air circulates freely through this gap, keeping the permafrost directly below the building frozen, preventing the thaw that would otherwise cause subsidence and collapse. The visual effect of an entire city on stilts is one of those things that photographs poorly and reality presents magnificently. You look at a Soviet-style apartment block, the kind of functional, aesthetically unambitious structure that Soviet urban planners produced in industrial quantities across the USSR, and you notice that it appears to be hovering. Not dramatically, not science-fictionally, but with a quiet defiance of normal architectural expectations. The building is connected to the ground by a forest of metal legs, and between those legs is a shadowed, wind-scoured space where cats sometimes shelter and children sometimes play, and the permafrost continues, undisturbed, its slow geological business. This lifting technique creates secondary problems that the builders then have to solve in turn, because building in extreme cold is a series of nested engineering puzzles where the solution to each problem generates the next problem. If the building is on stilts, then the pipes supplying water and heat to the building cannot run underground. They would freeze solid in the gap between building and earth, and even underground pipes in permafrost regions require extraordinary insulation and heating elements to prevent freezing. So the pipes in Yakutsk run above ground, bundled in thick insulation casings called utepliteli, snaking between buildings in elevated runs that crosshatch the streets and give parts of the city an industrial, slightly post-apocalyptic appearance. These pipe bundles are a constant feature of the Yakutsk streetscape. You duck under them, walk around them, accept them as architectural furniture. The insulation on those pipes has to be extraordinary because the temperature differential they are managing is extraordinary. Inside the pipe, you might have hot water at 60 or 70 degrees Celsius. Outside the pipe, in a January night, the air is minus 40 or 50. That is a differential of over 100 degrees across a few centimeters of insulation, maintained continuously for 8 months of the year. If the insulation fails, if there is a gap, a crack, a joint that has worked loose through the thermal expansion and contraction that happens when materials cycle between extreme temperatures, the pipe freezes. And when pipes freeze in a Yakutsk apartment block in January, the residents have a very bad time in a very specific way, because their heating system has just become inert and the outside temperature is trying to get into their home with the focused determination of something that has been trying to get in for centuries. Quirky engineering footnote that you did not know you needed. Because the ground in Yakutia is permanently frozen, it is extraordinarily difficult to bury anything. Graves, in the traditional sense of a hole in the earth deep enough to receive a coffin, were essentially impossible for most of Yakutian history. The frozen ground resisted digging with an intransigence that was both physically impractical and, depending on your perspective, philosophically interesting. Traditional Saka burial practices adapted to this constraint in ways that varied across different communities and periods, including above-ground log structures that housed the deceased, sometimes with personal belongings, in a manner that preserved the body through the same cold that made interment impossible. The permafrost, which destroys so many human plans, at least offers excellent preservation for the plans it thwarts permanently. Modern Yakutsk has solved the grave problem with industrial drills and explosives, but the older solutions are a reminder that every aspect of life in this region required a fundamental rethinking of assumptions that elsewhere in the world are so basic they barely register as assumptions at all. The ground is solid. Water runs in pipes underground. Buildings sit on foundations. Bodies are buried. These are not universal truths. In Yakutia, they are starting points for negotiation. The city that has grown from Beketov's 1632 fort is, in many respects, a thoroughly modern Russian regional capital. It has universities, museums, a diamond trading industry that reflects Yakutia's extraordinary mineral wealth, shopping centers, restaurants, a thriving local arts scene, and approximately 300,000 people who have decided that the coldest major city on Earth is where they would like to build their lives. The diamond wealth is genuinely staggering. Yakutia produces something like a quarter of the world's diamonds, extracted from kimberlite pipes scattered across the region, and the city's economy is intertwined with the extraction industry in ways that have brought prosperity and the familiar complications of resource dependency simultaneously. But walk through Yakutsk in January and the modernity sits in interesting tension with the raw physical facts of the environment. The buildings are modern, or at least post-Soviet, but they stand on their stilts like cautious animals keeping their feet off cold ground. The streets are scraped and sanded and maintained with considerable effort, because snow and ice at these temperatures behave differently than in milder climates. At -40, snow does not compact and melt under pressure the way it does at -5. It stays powdery, granular, almost sandy, accumulating in layers that squeak underfoot with a high-pitched compression, sound that Yakutsk residents barely notice, and that visitors find immediately distinctive. The sound of walking in extreme cold is one of those small sensory details that no photograph or description quite captures. That dry, creaking squeal of your boot against snow that has gone far past the point of wetness and entered a new physical state entirely. The light, or rather the absence of it, shapes the city as profoundly as the cold does. Yakutsk sits at roughly 62 degrees north latitude, which means that at the winter solstice, the sun rises for only about 4 or 5 hours each day. And rises is perhaps too vigorous a word, because it barely clears the horizon, casting a long, pale, reddish light across the snow that is beautiful and melancholy, and lasting only for the afternoon before the darkness returns. This perpetual dimness has effects on human psychology that are well documented and effects on human culture that are perhaps less quantifiable but equally real. The Saka have traditionally organized their spiritual and ceremonial life around the movements of the sun, with an intensity that makes sense when you understand how precious and brief those movements become in winter. We will come back to the spiritual dimension of Yakut life later in the night. For now, let us stay in the city, in the architecture, in the practical geometry of survival. The apartment block where you might live were you a resident of Yakutsk would be a study in thermal management. The windows would be triple or quadruple glazed, multiple panes of glass with sealed air or gas between them, forming an insulating buffer against the outside that is so effective the exterior pane frosts over completely while the interior remains clear. The frames would be sealed with a thoroughness that borders on obsessive, every gap filled, every crack addressed, because in this climate a draft is not an inconvenience but a refrigeration leak. The entrance to the building would likely feature a double-door airlock system, 2 doors in sequence, with a small vestibule between them, so that when someone enters or exits, the outside air never makes direct contact with the building interior. You open the outer door, enter the vestibule, close the outer door behind you, then open the inner door. This adds perhaps 15 seconds to every trip in and out of the building, and it saves an enormous amount of heat, and no one in Yakutsk ever props either door open. This is the city that Russian imperial ambition built on frozen bones, and that its residents have made into something genuinely livable through 3 centuries of accumulated architectural wisdom, engineering improvisation, and the particular kind of stubbornness that seems to develop in people who have decided that a place other people consider uninhabitable is, in fact, home. Tomorrow, the temperature will be -40-something. The stilts will hold. The pipes will probably carry heat. The triple-glazed windows will keep the outside where it belongs. And 300,000 people will go about their days in the coldest major city on Earth with the calm efficiency of people who have never known anything different, and would not trade it for anything warmer. The house you are sleeping in tonight, the traditional Yakut home, the Balagan, is not warm. Let us be clear about that from the beginning, because warmth, in the sense that you currently understand it lying in your comfortable bed, is not really the goal. The goal is survival-adjacent comfort. The goal is a temperature inside the dwelling that is cold enough to require everything you own in the way of blankets and furs and layered clothing, but warm enough that you will wake up in the morning rather than simply not. This is a meaningful distinction, and the Saka people spent centuries engineering their homes to land precisely in that narrow band between freezing to death and merely being extremely, profoundly cold. The balagan is a structure that evolved through direct negotiation with the environment over hundreds of years, and it shows. It is not pretty in the way that architecture in more forgiving climates gets to be pretty. It does not have decorative flourishes or ambitious geometry. It is a low, squat, slightly trapezoidal structure built from notched horizontal logs, with walls that lean slightly inward. Not dramatically, not enough to make you feel like you are inside a funnel, but enough that the slight inward tilt adds structural rigidity and reduces the surface area exposed to the cold. The roof is low and heavily insulated, traditionally covered with birch bark and then packed with earth and sometimes sod, creating a thermal mass that absorbs and slowly releases whatever heat the interior generates. The whole structure sits close to the ground, not on stilts, because the balagan predates the engineering solutions required by larger and heavier modern buildings, and the floor inside is often earthen, sometimes lined with wood planks, always covered with as many animal hides as the household can accumulate. The walls of a balagan are not just logs. Between the logs and over the exterior surface, the builders packed a mixture of clay, manure, and dry grass. A composite insulating material that sounds unappealing but performs remarkably well. The manure component is not incidental. Animal dung, particularly from horses and cattle, contains fibrous organic material and has a cellular structure that traps air effectively. And in the context of extreme cold insulation, trapped air is everything. The same principle underlies the design of modern synthetic insulation materials. The goal is to create as many tiny air pockets as possible, because air is a poor conductor of heat, and poor conductors of heat are what stand between you and the outside temperature. The Saka arrived at this principle empirically, through trial and error conducted over generations in conditions where the error part of trial and error had immediate and sometimes fatal consequences, which tends to accelerate the learning process considerably. The windows of a traditional balagan are small and few, typically one or two, positioned low in the wall and oriented to catch whatever weak winter sunlight is available. For most of Yakutian history, glass was not available or affordable for most households, so windows were covered instead with translucent materials that admitted some light while blocking the wind and cold. Fish bladder membrane was a common solution. Stretched, dried, and sewn into panels, it is surprisingly translucent and surprisingly durable, and the fish of the Lena River basin provided a locally abundant source. Ice panes were also used, cut from frozen rivers and fitted into window frames with a friction seal that was maintained by the cold itself. An ice window is self-sealing in Yakutian winter. The temperatures that would melt it elsewhere simply do not exist for 8 months of the year, and the window maintains its integrity with no maintenance required, which is the kind of engineering solution that feels like cheating but is actually just paying close attention to the environment you are working with. Inside the balagan, the spatial organization is dictated almost entirely by the location of the fire. The traditional Yakut hearth, the ama, sits in the center of the main living space or slightly to one side, and everything else in the room is arranged in relationship to it. The sleeping platforms are built along the walls, raised off the earthen floor by perhaps 30 or 40 centimeters, because cold air settles low, and even in a heated space the floor is significantly colder than a surface even slightly elevated above it. The platforms are wide enough to sleep on and covered with multiple layers of animal hides, ideally reindeer or horse hides, both of which have a remarkable insulating structure we will examine more closely in the next section. The family sleeps on these platforms, often together, with more hides piled on top, in an arrangement that combines body heat with material insulation to create a sleeping microclimate that is dramatically warmer than the room around it. The fire itself is a negotiation. This is the central drama of a Yakut winter night, the thing that sits behind every other activity and decision. How do you manage the fire to produce maximum warmth through the night while using minimum fuel, knowing that fuel primarily would, in a region where trees grow slowly and must be transported or harvested from considerable distances, is finite and precious? You cannot simply pile wood on and burn high and hot and sleep easy. A fire that burns too hot too fast exhausts its fuel by midnight and leaves the household in a cooling house for the remaining 6 or 7 hours of a January night. during which the interior temperature will begin its slow slide toward the outside temperature with a relentless physics that does not care about your comfort or your survival. So the fire management is deliberate and skilled. The Saka develops specific techniques for banking a fire, arranging larger logs around a hot core of coals in a configuration that allows slow, sustained combustion through the night, producing steady heat without the pyrotechnics of a fast burn. The larger logs are not burning so much as glowing, their outer surfaces charring and insulating the interior wood from the oxygen that would accelerate combustion. A properly banked fire in a balagan can maintain a bed of hot coals for 6 to 8 hours, radiating heat continuously at a lower intensity than an open flame but with far greater duration. Someone, usually the eldest member of the household, or whoever has been designated as firekeeper for the night, is responsible for checking the fire in the small hours and adding fuel if necessary. This person wakes in the coldest part of the night, in the coldest room, to perform what is possibly the most important act of domestic maintenance imaginable. The smoke from the fire exits through a hole in the roof, a simple, effective solution that also, inevitably, allows cold air to enter from above. The smoke hole is managed with a covering that can be partially opened or closed, traditionally made of the same birch bark used on the roof, or of animal membrane, adjusted throughout the day and night to balance ventilation against heat retention. Too closed, and the interior fills with smoke, which is unhealthy and also obscures the modest light produced by the fire. Too open, and the heat that the fire has spent all evening generating pours out into the night air with cheerful indifference to the household's warmth requirements. Finding the correct aperture for the smoke hole is a skill learned young and refined over a lifetime, and experienced Saka homemakers could read the behavior of smoke. Its speed, its color, its reluctance or eagerness to exit, to make adjustments so subtle they barely registered as conscious decisions. There is something almost meditative about this constant monitoring of fire and smoke and temperature, this continuous low-level attention to the thermal state of the home. In modern centrally heated houses, we set a thermostat and forget about it. The regulation happens invisibly, mechanically, and we are freed from the ancient task of paying attention to whether our shelter is keeping us alive. There is comfort in that freedom, obviously tremendous comfort, and we should not romanticize the exhausting vigilance required by a balagan in a Yakutian winter. But there is also something lost in the thermostat arrangement, some attentiveness to the relationship between shelter and environment, some practiced awareness of the physical conditions of your own home, that the balagan system required and cultivated, and that most of us have completely forgotten how to exercise. The interior of the balagan is organized into zones of relative warmth, and the household's sleeping arrangements reflect a sophisticated informal understanding of thermal dynamics. The area closest to the fire and slightly elevated is the warmest. This is traditionally where the youngest children sleep, because they are most vulnerable to cold and least able to generate sufficient body heat independently. The elderly also sleep in relatively warm positions, because the very old share with the very young a reduced capacity for thermoregulation that the community recognizes and accommodates. Adults of working age, who are simultaneously the most metabolically productive and the most cold-tolerant members of the household, tend to sleep in the cooler zones, away from the fire, understanding implicitly that their bodies can manage what the children's and elders cannot. This informal thermal zoning is a form of community care embedded in architecture. The house itself, through its design and the arrangement of its interior, distributes warmth according to need rather than status, and this represents either an admirable collective intelligence or simply a very practical response to the fact that dead children and dead elders are bad outcomes that attentive fire management can help prevent. Historians still argue whether traditional Saka household arrangements reflected an egalitarian social ethic or simply the pragmatic demands of survival, though in practice these two things may be less separable than the question implies. The balagan also serves as shelter for animals in the most brutal weather. A partition or an adjoining lean-to structure would house the household's horses or cattle during the worst cold snaps, because at minus 50 or 60 degrees even the hardy Yakutian breeds of domestic animals are at risk, and because animals that freeze to death represent a catastrophic economic loss that the household may not recover from. The proximity of animals to the living space is not glamorous. It introduces smells and sounds and the general lively chaos of large mammals in a small space, but it also contributes meaningfully to the thermal environment. A horse generates approximately a kilowatt of body heat continuously. Several horses in an attached space share that warmth through shared walls, and in Yakutian winter, a kilowatt of free heat from a horse is not something you dismiss for aesthetic reasons. The horses themselves, the Yakutian horse, a distinct breed that deserves its own extended appreciation, are one of the more extraordinary products of this environment. Short, stocky, with legs thicker than you would expect and a winter coat so dense it has been compared to that of a mammoth in photographs. The Yakutian horse can survive outdoors at -60 degrees Celsius by pawing through snow to find the frozen grass beneath, a behavior called cratering, and by huddling in groups with a social sophistication that distributes warmth among the herd. They have evolved a lower metabolic rate in winter, reducing their energy requirements precisely when food is most scarce, which is a biological trick so elegant it has attracted serious scientific interest. These horses have lived in Yakutia for at least 3,000 years, possibly longer, and the cold has shaped them as thoroughly as it has shaped everything else. Quirky footnote that the mainstream survival literature tends to skip: some Saka households traditionally used the body heat of their dogs in a very literal way. Particularly valued sled dogs would sleep inside the balagan, curled against the sleeping platforms and against the sleeping humans, contributing their warmth to the collective thermal budget of the household. This was not mere sentimentality toward working animals. A sled dog generating heat against your back through a January night in a house that is fighting the cold with everything it has is a meaningful and measurable contribution to your survival, and the Saka were too practical to be sentimental about survival strategies that actually worked. By the small hours of a Yakutian winter night, the balagan has reached its thermal equilibrium, the balance point between the heat generated by fire and bodies and animals, and the cold pressing in from every surface of the structure. This equilibrium is not warm, by any standard that you currently recognize as warm. The temperature inside a traditional balagan on a cold January night might sit somewhere between -10 and 0 degrees Celsius. Cold enough that the breath of the sleeping family members is visible in faint clouds above their faces. Cold enough that any extremity that escapes the covers will begin to chill within minutes. Cold enough that the water container near the door has a skim of ice by morning. But it is survivable. It is, by Yakutian standards, home. Outside, the whisper of the stars. Inside, the slow glow of a banked fire, the breathing of people and animals, the creak of logs contracting in the cold. The house is not warm. The house is alive. You are dressed, right now, in whatever you wear to bed, and whatever that is, it is almost certainly sufficient for the temperature of your room, which is almost certainly not -40. In Yakutia, the question of what to wear is not a question of fashion or personal expression or even comfort in any sense you would currently recognize. It is an engineering problem, a materials science challenge. A daily calculation involving surface area, thermal conductivity, moisture management, and the uncomfortable truth that the human body, for all its remarkable adaptations, was not designed with Siberian winter as the primary use case. The Saka people solved this engineering problem with an elegance that took centuries to develop and that modern outdoor clothing manufacturers have spent considerable money and laboratory time attempting to replicate, with partial success at best. The fundamental insight at the core of traditional Yakut clothing is one that sounds simple and is actually profound. The goal is not to generate warmth, but to trap it. Your body generates heat continuously as a byproduct of metabolism. The clothing's job is to prevent that heat from escaping into the environment faster than your body can produce it. Every design decision in traditional Yakut dress, the choice of materials, the construction of seams, the layering sequence, the way garments fasten and overlap, flows from this single organizing principle. The primary material is fur, and specifically the fur of animals that have themselves solved the extreme cold problem through millions of years of natural selection. Reindeer hide is the gold standard. The reindeer, or caribou, depending on which side of the nomenclature debate you prefer, has a winter coat of extraordinary sophistication. Each individual guard hair of a reindeer's outer coat is hollow. Not metaphorically hollow, not slightly porous, but genuinely hollow. A tube of keratin containing a column of air, sealed at both ends, that provides insulation through the same trapped air principle we discussed in the balagan walls. A square centimeter of reindeer winter coat contains thousands of these hollow hairs, creating a layer of trapped air so dense and so effective that the animal can stand in a blizzard at -50 and maintain a core body temperature of 38 degrees Celsius with no particular distress. When you make clothing from reindeer hide, processing the skin to preserve its flexibility while retaining the fur, you are essentially wearing the solution that evolution spent millions of years developing for exactly this climate. The Saka understood this intuitively long before the physics of thermal conductivity was formally described, and they used reindeer hide for their most important outer garments with the confidence of people who had tested every alternative and kept returning to the same answer. The outer coat, the traditional Saka doha or sometimes called a tong, is a full-length, heavily furred garment that reaches below the knee and sometimes to the ankle. It is cut with a generous, slightly A-line silhouette that allows free movement while preventing the garment from pressing tightly against the body at any point, because pressure compresses the fur and collapses the air pockets that provide insulation. A coat that fits too tightly is a coat that is failing at its primary job. The ideal fit is generous, what a modern fashion designer might call oversized, with room for the insulating layer of warm air trapped between the coat's interior surface and the wearer's underlying clothing layers. The cuffs are deep and can be pulled over the hands. The collar is high enough to cover the lower face when drawn up. The hem overlaps with the boot tops, closing the gap through which cold air might otherwise enter from below. The doha is worn fur-side out in moderate extreme cold, which is to say, cold that would constitute a meteorological emergency anywhere else on Earth but registers in Yakutia as a manageable winter day. In truly severe cold, the layering reverses. A second fur garment is worn underneath the outer coat, fur-side in, so that the wearer is sandwiched between two fur layers with their skin in contact with the warm, dense inner surface of the interior garment and the hollow guard hairs of the outer garment facing the environment. This double fur arrangement creates an insulating system so effective that the challenge shifts from keeping warm to managing the moisture produced by the body's own heat. Because a properly dressed person in Yakushan traditional clothing will sweat even in severe cold if they are physically active, and wet insulation is compromised insulation, which is a problem we will return to shortly. The boots, ederbe or tabuk depending on the community and the specific design, are perhaps the most critically engineered item in the entire Yakut wardrobe, because the feet are the most vulnerable extremity and the most difficult to keep warm. The ground in Yakutia in winter is not cold in the way that a cold floor is cold. It is cold in the way that a heat sink is cold, a surface with an essentially infinite capacity to absorb thermal energy from whatever contacts it, drawing heat out of your feet with a steady, patient, remorseless efficiency that no amount of willpower can counteract. Your feet must be insulated from the ground not just adequately but extraordinarily, because the thermal gradient between your body temperature and the ground temperature might span 80 or 90 degrees Celsius, and that gradient is pulling heat out of you continuously with every step. Traditional Yakut boots are constructed in layers. The innermost layer, against the skin, is often a sock made from the leg skin of a reindeer, specifically the leg skin, which is thicker and tougher than the body skin and has a denser fur that wears better under the friction of walking. Over this goes a boot of the main construction, often made from the same leg skin, or sometimes from the tanned hide of a horse, shaped and sewn with a sole thick enough to provide both insulation and durability on the ice and packed snow of a Yakushan trail. The sewing itself is a craft of considerable skill and importance. The seams must be watertight and windproof, because a gap in the seam of a boot at -50 is not a footwear malfunction, it is a frostbite delivery mechanism. Traditional Saka women, who were, historically, the primary makers of clothing in the community, developed sewing techniques using sinew thread that, when moistened by the body's warmth and the humidity trapped inside the boot, would swell and tighten, creating a seal that actually improved with wear rather than deteriorating. Historians still argue whether the extraordinary quality of Saka needlework, which extended beyond pure function into elaborate decorative beading and embroidery on ceremonial garments, reflects a pragmatic tradition that accumulated aesthetic refinement over time, or whether the decorative tradition and the functional tradition developed in parallel, each informing the other in ways that made both richer. What is not disputed is that the skill required to produce traditional Saka clothing at the level of quality necessary for reliable cold weather survival was substantial, was taught from childhood, and was recognized within the community as one of the most important competencies a person could possess. A woman who could sew well in the Saka tradition was not engaged in a domestic hobby. She was performing survival engineering. The mittens complete the outer layer, and they follow the same principles as everything else. Generous, furred, designed to trap air and prevent the escape of body heat from the hands. The soccer mitten is typically a single large compartment rather than the fingered glove design, because separate fingers increase surface area and therefore increase heat loss. Keeping all 4 fingers together in a shared space allows them to warm each other and reduces the total surface area radiating heat into the mitten's interior. The thumb has its own compartment because the thumb's independence of movement is essential for most tasks, but the other 4 fingers travel together, sharing warmth with the collective solidarity of people who understand that the individual has limitations that the group can address. Here is the engineering problem that traditional Yakut clothing had to solve that modern outdoor gear still struggles with: moisture. When you are dressed warmly enough to maintain body temperature at -50, you are dressed warmly enough to sweat during any physical exertion. And sweat, water vapor produced by your body, is catastrophic for fur insulation. Wet fur collapses. The hollow hairs of the reindeer coat lose their structural integrity when wet. The air pockets fill with liquid, and the insulation value drops precipitously. A wet fur coat in -50-degree weather is not a coat anymore. It is a liability, a surface wicking heat away from your body faster than a dry coat would have allowed. The Saka solution to this problem is elegant and counterintuitive. Design the clothing to allow moisture to pass through and escape to the exterior rather than accumulating inside the garment. The loose, generous fit of the doha allows air circulation, slow, controlled, but real, that carries moisture vapor out of the garment system before it can condense on the fur fibers. The layering sequence is designed so that the innermost layers, closest to the skin, are relatively thin and allow vapor transmission, while the outer layers provide the bulk insulation. When you stop moving and your sweat production drops, the garment's internal air circulation slows and the insulation value increases. The system is dynamic. It responds to your activity level in a way that a single heavy layer cannot. This dynamic moisture management is something that modern technical outdoor clothing, with its Gore-Tex membranes and moisture-wicking synthetic base layers and breathable waterproof shells, is explicitly trying to achieve, and achieves reasonably well for the temperatures it is designed for. But outdoor clothing engineers who have studied traditional saka designs in detail have noted, with varying degrees of professional discomfort, that the traditional system performs comparably to modern high-end technical clothing in the temperature ranges where both can be tested, and outperforms modern gear at the most extreme temperatures, where the synthetic materials start to lose flexibility and the mechanical properties of modern fabrics begin to degrade in ways that reindeer hide, which has been tested at these temperatures by the animal wearing it for millions of years, simply does not. The children's clothing in a saka household deserves particular mention because it illustrates the depth of thought embedded in the tradition. Infants and very young children were traditionally dressed in an all-in-one suit made from the softest reindeer skin, the skin of young animals with finer, softer fur, that covered everything except the face. The suit was designed to be easy to open for diaper changes, because a screaming infant in a Yakutian winter who needs to be partially undressed for care is a situation that needs to be resolved as quickly as physically possible, and the traditional design built that urgency into the fastening system. The mothers who designed these suits were not just sewing, they were doing human factors engineering for a user who could not communicate their needs clearly and whose thermal tolerance was genuinely life or death low. Older children were dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing, the same layering, the same materials, the same construction principles, because the physics of cold does not make exceptions for youth and the saka tradition did not encourage the kind of sentimental underestimation of children's capacity to endure serious conditions that characterizes some more temperate cultures. Children in Yakutia learned to dress themselves correctly at an age when children elsewhere are still being reminded to put on a hat, because in Yakutia the consequence of not putting on your hat is not a cold you might catch but a nose you might lose. One genuinely strange quirk of Yakutian cold weather dressing that tends to surprise outsiders. Experienced Yakut residents will often deliberately underdress slightly, wearing less than they feel they might need, before any period of significant physical exertion, because arriving at your destination slightly chilled but dry is substantially safer than arriving warm but damp with sweat that will chill you rapidly the moment you stop moving. The saying, translated loosely, runs something like, dress for the first 10 minutes of standing still and you will spend the next hour drying out. Dress for the last 10 minutes of hard walking and you will stay dry all day. This is practical wisdom encoded in a culture that learned it through consequences. But it also describes a relationship with discomfort, a willingness to tolerate temporary cold in the service of longer-term thermal management that runs through Yakut survival culture more broadly and that we will encounter again when we look at sleep. The clothing comes off in layers at the end of the day, each layer hung or arranged carefully to dry and air before the next wearing. Fur that is damp must be dried slowly, away from direct heat. Too close to the fire and the hide cracks, the fur scorches. The garment that took weeks to sew and represents an enormous investment of labor and resources is damaged perhaps irreparably. The drying of clothing is a nightly ritual as important as the banking of the fire, and both tasks are part of the same continuous maintenance of the household survival systems that constitutes domestic life in Yakutia winter. You, in your bed, are wearing exactly the right amount of clothing for your environment, and you probably did not have to think about it for more than 30 seconds. Somewhere in Yakutia tonight, someone is making a careful decision about the precise configuration of layers that will get them through tomorrow's particular temperature, for tomorrow's particular activities, and getting it wrong in either direction has real consequences. There is a kind of focused attention in that, a daily engagement with the physics of your own survival, that is exhausting to imagine and probably quite clarifying to live. The human body, at rest in a comfortable room, burns somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 calories per day just maintaining its basic functions. The heartbeat, the breathing, the low hum of cellular activity that constitutes being alive without doing much else. Add moderate physical activity and that number climbs. Add extreme cold, and something interesting happens that most people in temperate climates never have occasion to discover. Your body's caloric requirements increase significantly, not just because of the extra physical effort of moving through snow and ice in heavy clothing, but because thermogenesis, the process of generating body heat, is metabolically expensive in a way that sitting in a warm room simply is not. In Yakutia winter, your body is burning calories to stay warm continuously, not just when you are active and the furnace never gets to rest. Researchers studying cold climate populations have documented caloric requirements in traditional Yakutian lifestyles that would read as alarming overconsumption by the standards of modern nutritional guidance designed for sedentary people in heated buildings. Estimates vary considerably depending on activity level and season, but figures of 4,000 to 6,000 calories per day for physically active adults during the coldest months appear in the literature without surprise. This is not gluttony. This is thermodynamics. Your body needs fuel to generate heat the same way a furnace needs fuel to generate heat, and in a climate where the temperature differential between your body and the environment regularly exceeds 80 degrees Celsius, the furnace is running hard all the time. The food that the Saka eat, that you, in tonight's imagining, are eating to stay alive in this frozen world, is therefore not food in the casual, pleasurable, Instagram photographable sense that modern food culture tends to emphasize. It is fuel, chosen and prepared with a ruthless efficiency that prioritizes caloric density, availability in a frozen environment, and the practical reality that elaborate cooking is difficult when your primary heat source is a banked fire and your kitchen is, in ambient temperature terms, a very cold room. Fat is the cornerstone of the Yakutian diet, and understanding why requires a brief detour into biochemistry that is actually quite interesting once you get past the cultural conditioning that tells you fat is the enemy. Fat contains approximately 9 calories per gram, compared to 4 calories per gram for both protein and carbohydrates. This means that for a given weight of food, and in a subsistence economy where every kilogram of provisions represents labor and risk, fat delivers more than twice the caloric return of other macronutrients. In a cold climate where calories are survival and weight of provisions is a genuine logistical constraint, this is not a minor advantage. It is the difference between carrying enough food for a week and running short on day 4. The Saka diet historically centered on horse meat and horse products, horse milk, fermented horse milk, horse blood, and the fat of horses raised on the grasslands of the Lena Basin. The Yakutian horse, which we met briefly in the Balagan section looking romantically warm and magnificently furry, is not just a survival partner and a transportation asset and a source of warmth through shared walls. It is the primary food animal of the traditional Saka economy, and every part of the horse was used with the comprehensive frugality that characterizes subsistence cultures that cannot afford waste. The meat was eaten fresh when an animal was slaughtered, dried for preservation, or stored frozen, which in Yakushin winter requires no technology whatsoever beyond placing the meat outside, where the temperature will preserve it more effectively than any modern freezer indefinitely. Frozen raw meat is a feature of Yakushin cuisine rather than a sign of culinary desperation. And this is one of those cultural food practices that outsiders tend to receive with expressions of theatrical horror before being persuaded to try it and discovering that the reality is considerably more nuanced than the description suggested. Stroganina, thinly shaved frozen raw fish or meat, typically eaten immediately after shaving while still frozen, is perhaps the most internationally recognized Yakushin dish. Though internationally recognized is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence, given that most of the international community remains entirely unaware of its existence. The fish most commonly used are the whitefish species native to Yakushin rivers: Nelma, muksun, chur, caught in summer and stored frozen through the winter. Their flesh preserved by the same cold that makes cooking difficult. Eating frozen raw fish in thin shavings is, from a food safety perspective, actually quite sensible in this specific context. The extreme cold that freezes the fish also destroys most of the parasites and pathogens that would make raw fish consumption risky in other contexts. This is not a universal principle. Raw fish in warm climates carries genuine risks, but at the temperatures where Yakushin stroganina is produced and consumed, the parasitological environment is substantially cleaner than it would be elsewhere. The Saka understood this empirically without the benefit of parasitology as a formal discipline, which is a recurring pattern in traditional knowledge systems. The practice precedes the explanation by centuries, and the explanation, when it eventually arrives, confirms that the practice was well-founded. The fat from horses and fish was consumed in quantities that would alarm a modern cardiologist operating from guidelines developed for Western populations with entirely different metabolic contexts. Raw horse fat, in particular, was, and in some communities still is, eaten directly, in chunks, as a standalone food rather than a cooking medium or a flavoring agent. This sounds extreme until you consider that a person burning 5,000 calories per day in -50 weather has energy requirements that carrot sticks and lean protein are structurally incapable of meeting, and that the Saka body, adapted over generations to this diet, processes animal fat with a metabolic efficiency that differs measurably from populations without this dietary history. Historians still argue whether the apparent cardiovascular health advantages observed in some traditional cold climate populations reflect genetic adaptation to high-fat diets. The specific composition of wild animal fats compared to domesticated animal fats, the high activity levels that accompany traditional lifestyles, or some combination of factors that epidemiology has not yet fully untangled. The fermented products of the Saka dairy tradition deserve their own moment of attention, because they represent a solution to a preservation and nutrition problem that is simultaneously ancient and ingenious. Komis, fermented mare's milk, is a drink common across the steppe cultures of Central Asia, and the Saka version has its own particular character shaped by the specific flora of the Yakushin environment and the cold conditions under which fermentation occurs. Fermentation is, among other things, a preservation strategy. It converts sugars into alcohol and acids that inhibit the growth of spoilage organisms, extending the useful life of a food product. In a Yakushin context where the warm months when dairy production is possible are brief and the cold months when other food sources are scarce are long, the ability to preserve summer milk in a form that remains nutritious and palatable through winter is practically significant. The byproducts of fermentation are also nutritionally valuable in ways that go beyond simple calories. Fermented dairy products contain probiotics, living microbial communities that support digestive health, and the B vitamins produced by fermentation bacteria, including B12, which is critical for neurological function and which is otherwise available primarily from animal products. In a diet that is already heavily animal-based, B12 deficiency is not typically a concern for Yakut communities. But the general principle that fermentation adds nutritional value beyond the base ingredients is one that food scientists have validated thoroughly in recent decades, and that traditional food cultures seem to have worked out through observation long before the vitamins were named. There is a particular Saka fermented product called surat, a thick, slightly sour fermented milk product somewhere between yogurt and sour cream in texture, that appears in both everyday diet and in ceremonial contexts. The ceremonial dimension is important. Food in Saka culture is not purely functional. The preparation and sharing of food is embedded in a social and spiritual framework that transforms eating from a caloric transaction into a relational act. We will look at the spiritual dimensions of Yakut life more fully in a later section. But for now, it is worth noting that even the most pragmatically motivated cuisine exists within a cultural context that gives it meaning beyond mere survival. And that the surat consumed at a summer Yakyak festival, the great Saka celebration of the summer solstice, carries associations and significance that the same product consumed on an ordinary winter morning does not. The preservation of food through freezing, nature's own technology in Yakutia, creates a phenomenon that is unique to extreme cold environments and that has no real equivalent in temperate food culture: the frozen food storehouse. In traditional Saka households, a pit dug into the permafrost served as a natural freezer of extraordinary reliability, not a root cellar, which functions through the relative insulation of the earth to maintain temperatures above freezing. A permafrost pit, which maintains temperatures well below freezing year-round, provides conditions equivalent to a modern commercial deep freeze without electricity, without refrigerant chemicals, without any technology more sophisticated than a shovel and a wooden cover. Meat, fish, berries gathered in summer, organs that would spoil within hours in a temperate climate, all could be stored in a permafrost pit and retrieved months later in a state of preservation so complete that the flavor profile of the original food is largely intact. The berries are worth a moment's pause because they represent the vegetable component of a diet that otherwise skews heavily toward animal products, and because the berries of the Yakushan summer, cloudberries, crowberries, lingonberries, wild currants, are packed with vitamin C at concentrations that reflect their adaptation to an environment where the growing season is compressed into a brief, intense burst of productivity. Scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency disease that devastated populations cut off from fresh produce during long winters, was historically not the problem in Saka communities that it was in, say, European polar expeditions, and the reasons are multiple. The berries, stored frozen through winter, retained their vitamin C content. Raw meat, which the Saka ate regularly, contains vitamin C that cooking destroys, and the fermented dairy products contributed additional nutritional breadth. The European explorers who got scurvy while surrounded by indigenous populations who did not should perhaps have asked more questions about what those populations were eating, but this is a recurring theme in the history of Arctic exploration that we can explore with a gentle sigh and move past. Cooking, when it happens, is simple and efficient by necessity. The primary method is boiling meat or fish submerged in water over the fire, which produces both a cooked protein and a broth that is consumed separately and that represents a significant nutritional and caloric contribution on its own. The broth from boiled horse or reindeer is rich in gelatin from the collagen in the connective tissue, in fat that renders out from the meat, and in minerals that leach from the bones if they are included in the pot. Drinking warm broth in a Yakushan winter is not a wellness trend or a culinary affectation. It is a delivery mechanism for calories, fat, and warmth. The liquid enters your stomach at near boiling temperature and your body absorbs that thermal energy directly, providing a brief, intense experience of warmth from the inside that no amount of external insulation can replicate. The psychological dimension of food in extreme cold is also real and documented. Warmth from food, the experience of something hot entering your body when your body is fighting to maintain its core temperature, produces a response that goes beyond the caloric. There is comfort in it, a sense of reassurance that the thermal battle is, at least momentarily, being won from the inside as well as defended from the outside. The Saka tradition of offering hot food and drink to anyone who enters a dwelling, even a stranger, even in times of scarcity, reflects both a social ethic of hospitality and a practical understanding that a person who has been outside in Yakushan winter needs warmth delivered internally as urgently as they need to come inside. The meal that closes the day, eaten in the warm adjacent interior of the Balagan as the evening deepens and the fire settles into its banking configuration, is typically the heartiest of the day, the meal that will provide the caloric foundation for the long, cold night ahead. Your body will continue burning calories while you sleep, because maintaining your core temperature through 8 hours in a room that is itself barely above freezing requires a metabolic effort that does not pause for sleep. The food you eat tonight is not just tonight's dinner. It is tomorrow morning's survival, stored as body fat that your sleeping metabolism will slowly convert into the heat that keeps you alive until dawn. Pull the blanket a little tighter. Somewhere in Yakutia, the evening meal is finished, the bowls are cleared, The fire is being arranged for the night, and bodies full of horse fat and frozen fish and fermented milk are finding their places on the sleeping platforms, preparing for the long, cold, dark, and surprisingly well-provisioned business of a Yakutian winter night. Sleep in Yakutia is not the soft, ambient, temperature-neutral experience that most of the world takes for granted. It is a physiological event conducted in partnership with cold, a nightly negotiation between the human body's remarkable capacity to maintain its core temperature and an environment that is working with patient physical inevitability to equalize that temperature with its own. You do not simply lie down and drift off in a Yakutian winter night. You construct the conditions for sleep with the same deliberate attention you bring to everything else in this environment, because getting it wrong is not a matter of sleeping poorly. Getting it wrong is a matter of not waking up. The science of what happens to the human body in extreme cold during sleep is genuinely fascinating and somewhat unsettling to contemplate from the warmth of your current position. Your core body temperature, which sits at approximately 37 degrees Celsius when you are awake and active, naturally drops by about 1 degree during normal sleep. A circadian rhythm that is tightly regulated and that, among other effects, triggers the release of melatonin and the onset of deeper sleep stages. This temperature drop is normal and beneficial under ordinary circumstances. In a cold environment, however, the body's thermoregulatory system faces an additional challenge. It must maintain core temperature against an external environment that is pulling heat away from the body's surface continuously, while simultaneously managing the reduced metabolic rate of sleep and the consequent reduction in internal heat generation. The body responds to this challenge with a cascade of physiological adjustments that you would recognize as the physical sensations of being cold, vasoconstriction, which reduces blood flow to the extremities to protect the core, shivering, which generates heat through rapid muscle contractions at the cost of significant caloric expenditure, and the behavioral response of curling into a fetal position, which reduces the surface area of the body exposed to the cold environment. The fetal sleep position, which people in temperate climates sometimes adopt as a comfort preference, is in extreme cold a thermoregulatory strategy. The body is literally trying to become smaller to reduce its radiating surface area, to slow the rate at which the environment is drawing heat away from its most critical structures. The Saka sleeping arrangement, which we touched on in the Balagan section, is designed to support these physiological responses rather than working against them. The raised sleeping platform removes the sleeper from the coldest air, which pools at floor level. The multiple layers of reindeer hide provide an insulating envelope that traps the body's radiated heat, creating a microclimate within the sleeping furs that can be 20 or 30 degrees warmer than the room air a few centimeters away. The practice of sleeping with other people, family members sharing sleeping platforms, bodies in contact or close proximity, adds the thermal contribution of multiple heat-generating bodies to the microclimate, multiplying the effect of the insulating furs. This communal sleeping arrangement is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it represents such a departure from the privacy norms around sleep that modern Western culture has developed. The idea that sleep is a private, individual activity, conducted alone or at most with a romantic partner, in a dedicated room with a door that closes, is a historically recent and geographically specific cultural development. For most of human history, in most parts of the world, sleep was communal. Families, and sometimes entire communities, slept together in shared spaces, and the reasons were simultaneously social and thermodynamic. Warmth is a shared resource when bodies are the primary heat generators, and sharing it makes sense with exactly the same logic that sharing any scarce resource makes sense. In Yakutian winter, the communal sleeping arrangement is not a cultural choice that happens to have thermal benefits. It is a thermal necessity that has been woven into the cultural fabric so thoroughly that the thermal and the cultural are inseparable. A child sleeping pressed against a parent's back in a pile of reindeer hides on a January night in Oymyakon is not just warm. They are participating in a practice that is simultaneously a survival strategy, a family ritual, a transmission of physical security from one generation to the next, and an embodied lesson in the fundamental Saka understanding that survival in this environment is collective rather than individual. The folklore of the Yakutian night is populated with figures and forces that reflect the community's long experience of the specific psychological texture of extreme cold darkness. The Abihi, malevolent spirits in Saka traditional belief, are associated with cold, with darkness, with the north, with the dangerous hours between midnight and dawn when the temperature is at its lowest and the fire has been burning longest without fresh fuel. This is not coincidence. The human imagination, working with the raw materials of lived experience, tends to populate the genuinely dangerous parts of the world with the most frightening entities. And in Yakutia, the genuinely dangerous parts of the world are the cold and the dark. The Abihi did not emerge from theological abstraction. They emerged from the real experience of what happens in the coldest hours of the coldest nights, when the fire dims and the temperature inside the balagan begins its slow descent and the darkness outside is absolute, and the sounds of the frozen forest, the exploding trees, the creak of ice, the distant movement of animals, carry through the stillness with unsettling clarity. There is a specific phenomenon of extreme cold that the Saka have named and that science has only relatively recently caught up to with formal terminology. The sound that the air itself makes at very low temperatures. The Saka call it the whisper of the stars, pagoda zvyazd in Russian, though the Saka term carries different resonances, and it refers to the faint crackling, hissing sound produced when water vapor in exhaled breath freezes instantly on contact with the extreme cold air. At -50 and below, this sound is audible not just from your own breath, but from the breath of anyone near you, creating a constant soft percussion of crystallization that in the darkness takes on an eerie, intimate quality. The stars seem closer at these temperatures, the atmosphere stripped of moisture and therefore of the haze that normally softens the night sky, and the combination of extraordinary stellar clarity overhead and the whispering sound of breath freezing in the air below creates an experience that is genuinely otherworldly, beautiful and threatening in equal measure. Historians still argue whether the Saka concept of the cold as a living, intentional force, something that pursues, that tests, that occasionally relents, reflects an animist cosmology in the formal anthropological sense, or simply the very reasonable response of a community living in daily intimate contact with a force that behaves, in its effects on human life, very much like an agent with preferences and intentions. When the cold kills a traveler who left the village underprepared, the explanation that the cold wanted them, that some spiritual dimension of the landscape exercised a kind of judgment, is not more irrational than the explanation that the traveler's core temperature dropped below 28 degrees Celsius and their cardiac rhythm became fatally disrupted. Both explanations are attempting to make meaning of the same event. One uses the language of physics, the other uses the language of relationship. The relationship between sleep and cold in extreme environments produces some physiological phenomena that appear in the medical literature with a clinical neutrality that fails to capture how strange they are to experience. Paradoxical undressing is perhaps the most dramatic in the final stages of severe hypothermia. As the core body temperature drops to critical levels, the sufferer often removes their clothing, sometimes all of it, driven by an overwhelming sensation of intense heat that is produced by the vasodilation that precedes cardiovascular collapse. The blood vessels of the extremities, which have been constricted for hours to protect the core, suddenly dilate, flooding the skin with warm blood in a final, fatal redistribution of the body's thermal resources. The sensation of burning warmth that accompanies this process is so convincing that people in the last stages of fatal hypothermia have been found in the snow, partially or fully unclothed, having apparently and sincerely believed they were overheating. The Saka were aware of this phenomenon long before it had a clinical name, and the awareness informed both their care for vulnerable community members during cold snaps and their understanding of the stages through which cold takes a person. The recognition that someone who suddenly reports feeling warm and begins to remove clothing is in immediate danger, not in recovery, is the kind of knowledge that you arrive at through observation of what happens when it goes wrong. And the Saka had abundant opportunity for that observation over many generations. The practical management of a Yakutian night's sleep involves a set of preparations that begin well before the household lies down. The fire is banked with careful deliberation, as we described, but beyond the fire, the sleeping furs are arranged to create the most effective insulating envelope possible. The hides are layered in a specific sequence that the household has worked out through experience. The hide with the densest fur goes on the outside, facing the room air, acting as a vapor barrier and an insulating shell. The softer, more flexible hides go closest to the body, conforming to the sleeper's shape and minimizing air gaps that would allow convective heat loss. The head, which loses a disproportionate amount of heat due to its high surface area relative to its mass and the fact that most people do not sleep with their heads under the covers, is protected by a fur hood or a separate head covering, or by pulling the sleeping hides up over the face and leaving only a small gap for breathing. The breathing gap is important and requires management. Breathing under the covers creates a warm, humid microclimate very quickly, but it also leads to moisture accumulation in the furs, and we have already discussed what moisture does to fur insulation. The Saka solution is to position the head at the edge of the sleeping pile, not fully exposed to the room air, but not fully submerged under the furs either, in a posture that allows warm exhaled breath to escape without carrying significant moisture into the sleeping system. This is a small thing and it sounds fussy, but in a context where the difference between effective and compromised insulation might be the difference between waking up and not waking up, small things are large things. There is a practice documented in several accounts of traditional Yakut life that falls into the category of extreme cold sleep management and that qualifies as genuinely quirky by any reasonable standard. The use of specific breathing techniques during sleep onset to pre-warm the immediate air inside the sleeping furs before fully committing to the sleeping position. By breathing slowly and deliberately in a partially enclosed posture, face directed toward the furs rather than the room, the sleeper creates a small bubble of warmed, humidified air around their head that makes the transition into the sleeping microclimate less brutal. This is not meditation. This is thermal preconditioning, performed instinctively by people whose bodies have learned through experience that the first few minutes of contact with cold bedding are the most physiologically demanding and that managing that transition carefully reduces the shivering, the discomfort, and the caloric expenditure of the adjustment period. The quality of sleep in extreme cold, once the insulating envelope has been established and the body has made its thermoregulatory adjustments, is reportedly deep and relatively dreamless, or rather, dreams in the Yakutian winter night tend to have a particular character that several ethnographic accounts describe as vivid, spatially immersive, and frequently involving the landscape of the immediate environment. Dreams of cold, of movement through snow, of the aurora overhead, of fire and warmth and food. The dream content of a people living at the edge of physiological tolerance tends to reflect the preoccupations of waking life with an intensity that the relatively comfortable dreams of temperate climate sleepers perhaps do not quite match. Your sleeping brain is processing the events and concerns of your waking life. In Yakutia, the events and concerns of waking life are, in large part, cold and warmth and survival and community and the long dark night. The dreams follow accordingly. Somewhere around 3 or 4 in the morning, the coldest hours arrive. The fire has been burning on its banked configuration for several hours. The interior temperature of the balagan has dropped from its early evening level, never warm but perhaps manageable, to its nighttime minimum, which might be several degrees below 0 Celsius even with the fire going. The sleeping family breathes their whisper of the stars under their pile of reindeer hides, their bodies doing the ancient metabolic work of staying alive in a cold that would kill them within hours if any of the layers of protection between them and it were to fail. The firekeeper stirs, checks the coals, adds a log with the quiet efficiency of someone performing a task they have done 10,000 times, and settles back into the hides. Outside, the temperature is somewhere below -50. The trees are cracking in the forest. The stars are extraordinary. The cold does not sleep because the cold does not need to, but the people do, and they have, with centuries of accumulated ingenuity, made it possible. The world outside the balagan in the deepest hours of a Yakutian winter night is not empty. This is important to understand because the darkness and the cold and the silence, that particular crystalline silence of extreme cold, where sound carries impossibly far and the absence of wind creates an acoustic stillness that feels almost pressurized, might suggest a landscape evacuated of life, a frozen void waiting for spring to repopulate it with meaning. But the Yakutian winter landscape is full of animals moving through the dark with a practiced efficiency that makes your own carefully engineered survival look touchingly improvised. Full of forces and presences that the Saka tradition recognizes and names and maintains relationships with, because in a world where the environment has this much power over human life, the appropriate response is not detachment but engagement. Let us start with the animals, because they are concrete and visible and their existence in this cold raises questions that the answers to are genuinely astonishing. The Siberian tiger, Panthera tigris altaica, ranges across parts of the Russian Far East in temperatures that would hospitalize an unprepared human within the hour, its massive body generating heat through a metabolic rate scaled to its size and insulated by a winter coat dramatically thicker than its summer fur. The wolverine, smaller and arguably more impressive pound for pound, ranges across the boreal forests of Yakutia with a ferocity and cold tolerance that has made it the subject of considerable scientific interest and considerable indigenous respect. The wolverine does not hibernate. It does not migrate. It simply continues, through the worst of the Yakutian winter, hunting and scavenging across a territory that might span hundreds of kilometers, fueled by a metabolism so efficient and a coat so dense that -40 is not a hardship but simply the ambient condition of existence. The reindeer herds that move through the Yakutian landscape in winter are following migration routes that predate human settlement of the region by thousands of years, moving between seasonal pastures with a navigational precision that researchers have only recently begun to understand in terms of the specific sensory cues the animals are using. Reindeer can see into the ultraviolet spectrum, a visual capability unique among large mammals, which allows them to perceive features of the snow-covered landscape that are invisible to human eyes, including patches of lichen beneath snow that reflect UV light differently from surrounding areas. The reindeer is, in other words, equipped with a snow-penetrating visual system that allows it to find food under conditions where the food source is completely invisible to every other large animal in the landscape. Evolution, given enough time and sufficient selective pressure, produces solutions of breathtaking elegance. The Siberian larch, Larix sibirica, is the dominant tree of the Yakutian boreal forest, the taiga, and it deserves recognition as one of the more remarkable organisms sharing this frozen world with the Saka people. Unlike most conifers, the Siberian larch is deciduous. It drops its needles in autumn and spends the winter as a bare-branch skeleton, reducing its water loss and its vulnerability to the desiccating effect of extreme cold on plant tissue. The larch can survive temperatures below -70 degrees Celsius, making it the cold-hardiest tree on Earth by a significant margin, and it does so through a combination of cellular adaptations that include the production of antifreeze compounds in its cellular fluid and a capacity to allow the water between its cells, but not within them, to freeze completely without damage. The tree, in the coldest months, is partially frozen. The cells themselves remain liquid. The tree does not consider this a problem. It is the larch forests that produce the explosive cracking sounds on the coldest nights. Not the trees freezing, as is sometimes reported, but the ice forming in the spaces between cells expanding and contracting with temperature fluctuations, or in some cases the wood itself contracting so rapidly in a sudden temperature drop that it splits along the grain with a report like a rifle shot. Walking through a larch forest at -60 on a still night, with these sounds erupting periodically from the darkness in multiple directions, is an experience that several non-Saka visitors have described as immediately and profoundly convincing in its suggestion that the forest is alive and paying attention. The Saka tradition agrees with this assessment, though it frames it in terms rather different from the experiential accounts of startled outsiders. Saka cosmology, the traditional spiritual and philosophical framework through which the Saka have historically understood the world, is an animist system of considerable complexity and sophistication, though animist is a term that carries enough academic baggage to require some unpacking. In the Saka understanding, the world is inhabited by a vast population of spirits, ichi, that animate every significant feature of the landscape and every significant category of being. The fire has its ichi, the river has its ichi, the forest has its ichi, the wind has its ichi, and the wind's ichi in a Yakutian winter is not a gentle presence. It is a force of considerable power and uncertain temperament that must be treated with respect and occasionally appeased. Individual trees of unusual size or age have their own ichi. Animals, particularly those on which human survival depends, the horse, the reindeer, the fish of the Lena, have ichi that mediate the relationship between the animal and the human community that hunts or herds it. This is not primitive superstition dressed in ethnographic clothing. It is a coherent philosophical system that encodes a set of relationships between human communities and their environment, relationships characterized by reciprocity, respect, and the recognition that the non-human world has its own agency and interests that human activity must take into account. The practical consequences of this worldview include behavioral norms that function as environmental management. You do not take more from the forest than you need, not because a conservation ethicist told you not to, but because the forest's itchy will notice and the consequences of offending it are worse than the short-term advantage of excess extraction. Whether or not you believe in the itchy as literal entities, the behavioral outcomes they produce are recognizable as sustainable resource management. And the Saka tradition maintained the ecological balance of the Yakutian environment for centuries before the concept of sustainability became a topic of international conferences. The shamans, Oyun for male practitioners, Udigan for female, were the specialists who mediated between the human community and the spirit world, and their role in Yakutian winter was particularly critical because winter was when the spirit world pressed closest. The logic is straightforward. In summer, the world is full of light and growth and abundance, and the relationship between humans and their environment, while always requiring attention, has a generosity to it. In winter, the world is dark and cold and scarce, and the forces that can harm human life are at their most active and most powerful. The Abihi, those cold, northern, malevolent spirits we met earlier in the night, were most dangerous in the darkest months, and the Oyun's work of monitoring, negotiating with, and when necessary combating these forces was at its most intense and most demanding during the long winter nights. The Oyun's tools included drumming. The ritual drum, the tungur, was a circular frame drum whose sound was understood to carry into the spirit world and to function as both a communication device and a vehicle for the shaman's spirit during trance journeys. The drumming of a Saka shaman performing a winter healing ritual has been described by observers across several centuries with a consistency that suggests the practice changed relatively little over long periods. The slow, rhythmic beating that gradually accelerates, the shaman's body responding to the rhythm with increasing movement, the transition into trance states that allow the practitioner to travel in spirit to the realms where the causes of illness or misfortune can be addressed. The sound of a drum in a dark winter night in Yakutia carries through the cold air with remarkable clarity, and the communities within earshot would have known from the sound alone that the shaman was working, that someone in the community needed help, and that the specialists were engaged. Historians still argue whether the altered states of consciousness documented in shamanic practice across Siberian cultures reflect genuine neurological phenomena produced by rhythmic drumming, hyperventilation, and sensory deprivation, or whether they are better understood as culturally constructed performances that achieve their effects through social expectation and the symbolic framework provided by the community's shared belief system, or whether these two explanations are as distinct as the argument assumes. The neuroscience of rhythmic entrainment, the tendency of the brain's electrical activity to synchronize with external rhythmic stimuli, suggests that sustained drumming at specific tempos does produce measurable changes in brain state, and that these changes share characteristics with other altered states that are well documented in the scientific literature. Whether those brain state changes constitute the spirit travel described by the practitioners is a question that sits at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy of mind, and cultural epistemology, and it has not been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. What is not contested is the social function of the shaman in Yakutian winter communities. In a small, isolated group of people facing the combined psychological pressures of extreme cold, limited light, physical confinement, and the constant low-level awareness that survival is not guaranteed, the presence of a specialist whose role is to identify and address the spiritual dimensions of misfortune, to locate meaning in suffering, to perform the community's relationship with the forces that govern its world, to provide a framework within which the arbitrary cruelties of a cold winter can be understood as something other than random, is not a luxury. It is a psychological infrastructure as important as the physical infrastructure of the balagan and the clothing and the food stores. The animals that appear in Saka spiritual tradition are not simply food sources or environmental features. They are beings with their own standing in the cosmological order, some of them functioning as spirit helpers or guides for the shaman, some as protective forces for particular families or lineages, some as embodiments of the powers of particular landscape features. The bear, the Yakutian brown bear, which hibernates through the winter and emerges in spring in a manner that the Saka associated with death and resurrection, occupies a particularly complex position in Saka spiritual thought. The bear is simultaneously a dangerous predator, a potent symbol of the relationship between death and renewal, and a being whose killing requires specific ritual protocols to manage the spiritual consequences of taking such a powerful life. A bear hunt in the Saka tradition was not simply a hunting expedition. It was a ceremony. The raven, Corvus coryx, which does not migrate from Yakutia but remains through the winter as one of the few birds hardy enough to endure the cold, appears in Saka tradition as a complex figure associated with cunning, with the boundary between worlds, and with the carrying of messages between the human community and the spirit realm. Ravens in Yakushan winter congregate around human settlements with an intelligence that borders on the socially sophisticated. They learn the rhythms of the community, position themselves to benefit from human food waste, and display a problem-solving capacity that has been extensively studied by animal cognition researchers and that consistently exceeds the expectations of people who think of birds as simple creatures. A raven that has spent several winters around an Oymikon settlement knows the community schedule, knows which dogs are likely to share food and which to avoid, knows that the kitchen waste is discarded at a particular time and location, and adjusts its behavior accordingly with a flexibility that requires something very much like planning. The Saka relationship with ravens was therefore not one of simple symbolic association but of genuine daily coexistence with a bird that demonstrated visibly and repeatedly that it was paying close attention to the human community and drawing its own conclusions. In that context, the attribution of spiritual significance to the raven feels less like the projection of human meaning onto an indifferent animal and more like a recognition, imperfect, culturally mediated, but not entirely wrong, that the raven is engaged with the human community in ways that go beyond the purely transactional. Outside the Balagan tonight, somewhere in the dark and the cold, a raven is roosting in a large tree with its feathers fluffed to maximum volume, its body temperature maintained by a metabolism that runs at a rate almost incomprehensible for an animal its size, its dark eyes closed against the cold in a sleep that is lighter and more easily interrupted than yours. The wolverine is moving through the forest a few kilometers away, covering ground in the dark with an unhurried efficiency. The horses are standing in their shared warmth at the edge of the settlement, their breath rising in visible clouds that the extreme cold turns to ice crystals before they disperse. The spirits of the landscape, if you are inclined to extend your hospitality to the cosmological framework of the people who have lived here longest, are present and attentive, as they always are, in the cold and the dark and the immense, luminous, utterly indifferent Yakushan night. You are inside. You are warm enough. The fire glows. Sleep is still possible. The Soviet Union arrived in Yakutia with the confidence of an ideology that believed, sincerely and with considerable institutional force, that the correct application of modern technology and collective organization could overcome any natural obstacle, including, apparently, the coldest inhabited region on Earth. The Bolsheviks who extended Soviet power into the Sakha Republic through the 1920s and 1930s were not the first outsiders to underestimate Yakutia's cold, but they were perhaps the most systematically ambitious in their underestimation, and the consequences of that ambition played out across the following decades in ways that were simultaneously impressive, tragic, and instructive about the limits of ideological confidence in the face of permafrost. The collectivization of Saka pastoral life, the forced reorganization of traditional horse and reindeer herding into collective farms, or kolkhozy, proceeded with the same blunt administrative instrument that Soviet collectivization applied everywhere, and produced in Yakutia the same catastrophic disruption it produced elsewhere, compounded by the specific vulnerabilities of an extreme cold environment. Traditional Saka herding practices encoded centuries of knowledge about seasonal movements, herd management, and the relationship between pasture availability and herd size that had been calibrated through generations of direct experience with the landscape. Collective farm management, imposed by administrators who in many cases had never seen a reindeer and were operating from theoretical frameworks developed for agricultural conditions utterly unlike those of the Yakushan taiga, discarded much of this knowledge in favor of centrally determined quotas and production targets. The results were predictable in retrospect and were predicted at the time by Saka community members whose warnings were either ignored or actively suppressed as counter-revolutionary sentiment. Herds that were moved to new pastures on administratively convenient schedules rather than ecologically appropriate ones found inadequate forage. Animals that were slaughtered to meet meat production quotas were not replaced at rates that the remaining herd could sustain. The finely calibrated relationship between human community, animal population, and landscape that had sustained Saka life for centuries was disrupted in the space of a few administrative decisions, and the disruption took decades to partially recover from. The Gulag geography of Yakutia represents a different and darker chapter of the Soviet period, and one that shaped the region's demographic and cultural landscape in ways that are still visible today. The Kolyma region, technically in neighboring Magadan Oblast but deeply intertwined with Yakutian geography and history, became the site of some of the Soviet Union's most brutal forced labor camps, where prisoners were worked in gold and uranium mines at temperatures that the camp administration acknowledged were lethal and continued the work regardless. The death rates in Kolyma camps during the height of the Stalinist terror in the late 1930s were among the highest in the entire Gulag system, and the cold was not incidental to those death rates, it was operational. The extreme climate of the region was a tool of the carceral system, as deliberately deployed as the barbed wire and the armed guards. Writers and intellectuals who survived Kolyma and lived to describe it, most notably Varlam Shalamov, whose Kolyma tales constitute one of the most harrowing documents of 20th century experience, described the cold as a presence with moral dimensions, as something that the camp system used with an intentionality that transformed it from a natural phenomenon into an instrument of state violence. The cold that the Saka had negotiated with for centuries, building their balagan and sewing their reindeer coats and banking their fires with accumulated ancestral wisdom, became in the Gulag context a weapon deployed against people who had none of those tools, none of that knowledge, and no community of care to distribute the burden of survival. This contrast between the Saka relationship with the cold, which was a relationship of hard-won coexistence built on deep knowledge and communal support, and the Gulag prisoners' relationship with the cold, which was one of naked exposure enforced by the state, illuminates something important about what the traditional Saka way of life actually represented. It was not simply a set of survival techniques that could be extracted from their cultural context and applied by anyone. It was a total system, technical, social, spiritual, ecological, whose components were interdependent in ways that made the whole dramatically more effective than any of the parts in isolation. You cannot simply hand someone a reindeer coat and a knowledge of fire banking and expect them to survive Yakutian winter the way the Saka did. The coat and the fire are embedded in a community structure, a knowledge transmission system, a cosmological framework, and a set of ecological relationships that together constitute the actual survival technology. The Soviet period also brought, alongside its catastrophes, infrastructure that genuinely transformed material life in Yakutia in ways that are difficult to evaluate with simple moral arithmetic. The city of Yakutsk grew substantially under Soviet investment. Schools, hospitals, research institutions, the University of Yakutsk, founded in 1956, heating infrastructure that extended the possibility of warm indoor living to a much larger proportion of the population than had ever had access to it before. The Permafrost Institute, the Melnikov Permafrost Institute, established in Yakutsk in 1960, became one of the world's leading centers for the scientific study of frozen ground, producing research that informed construction practices not just in Russia but globally. The Institute's underground research facility, carved directly into the permafrost beneath the city, maintained at a constant -5 degrees Celsius by the ground itself, is one of the more peculiar and wonderful scientific facilities in existence, a laboratory that uses the phenomenon it studies as its own infrastructure. The roads and air connections that Soviet investment created made Yakutia less isolated from the rest of Russia and the world, though less isolated is doing significant work in that sentence given that Yakutsk still has no road connection to the broader Russian highway network that functions in summer. The river ice roads that freeze in winter remain, for many communities, the primary overland connection to the outside world during the coldest months, which means that the infrastructure of the modern era is still, at its foundation, dependent on the same river ice that the Saka have been crossing for centuries. The Lena River crossing at Yakutsk is one of the more dramatic examples of this dependency. In summer, a ferry operates. In winter, the river is a highway. In the shoulder seasons, when the ice is forming or melting, there is no crossing at all, and Yakutsk becomes, briefly, an island city accessible only by air. The aviation infrastructure that the Soviet Union built across Siberia, the network of airstrips that connected remote settlements to regional centers, is genuinely one of the more impressive logistical achievements of the Soviet period, and it remains essential to Yakutian life in ways that the collapse of the Soviet Union tested severely. When the USSR dissolved in 1991 and the subsidized aviation routes that had connected remote Yakutian communities to the outside world lost their funding, the practical isolation of many settlements increased dramatically. Communities that had become accustomed to regular air supply of goods, food, medicine, equipment, found themselves suddenly dependent on logistic systems that were either unavailable or unaffordably expensive without subsidy. The post-Soviet decade was, for many Yakutian communities, a period of renewed hardship that combined the loss of Soviet infrastructure with the disruption of traditional practices that collectivization had already damaged. The diamond industry that emerged as Yakutia's primary economic asset in the post-Soviet period brought a different set of changes. The Mirny mine, an open-pit diamond mine of such extraordinary dimensions that it has its own weather system, generating updrafts powerful enough to be hazardous to small aircraft, became one of the most productive diamond operations in the world and the economic foundation of a Yakutian prosperity that was unevenly distributed but real. The city of Mirny, built around the mine in the 1950s, is another example of Soviet-era construction on permafrost, another city of stilts and above-ground pipes and triple-glazed windows that has persisted into the present as a functional if not thriving settlement. Modern Yakutsk in 2026 is a city navigating the intersection of several competing realities simultaneously, and the navigation is not always graceful but is often impressive. The permafrost that the city sits on is thawing, not because of the local climate per se, but because global warming is affecting the Arctic and subarctic at rates 2 to 3 times faster than the global average, and the permafrost that the city's entire built infrastructure depends on for structural stability is warming from below and above in ways that the engineers who designed the stilted buildings did not fully account for. Buildings that were designed with a specific permafrost temperature in mind are now sitting on permafrost that is a degree or two warmer than the design specification, and a degree or two warmer is enough to reduce the load-bearing capacity of frozen ground significantly. The tilting buildings of Yakutsk, which were always a feature of the landscape, are tilting more, and some of them are tilting in ways that are no longer cosmetic. The response to this infrastructural crisis is a combination of engineering intervention, additional piles driven deeper into still stable permafrost, active cooling systems installed beneath buildings to maintain frozen ground temperatures, and the beginning of a longer-term reckoning with what it means to have built a city on a foundation whose stability was predicated on a climate that is changing. This is not a problem unique to Yakutsk. Permafrost thaw is affecting infrastructure across the Arctic, but Yakutsk, as the largest city in the permafrost zone, faces it at a scale that makes it a kind of field laboratory for the engineering and planning challenges that climate change is creating in cold regions globally. The younger generation of Yakutsk residents negotiates a relationship with their city's extreme cold that differs from their grandparents' relationship in texture, if not in fundamental terms. They have smartphones that tell them the exact temperature before they open the door. -43, dress accordingly. They have social media accounts where they post videos of boiling water thrown into the air for the entertainment of followers in warmer climates, a practice that has become something of a Yakutsk signature genre on platforms that reward the visually dramatic and the geographically exotic. They have centrally heated apartments with double-door airlocks and above-ground insulated pipe bundles, and they complain about the cold with the fluent irony of people who understand that their home's extreme conditions are simultaneously a hardship and a source of identity. There is a quiet cultural pride in Yakutsk that is related to but distinct from the simple fact of surviving cold. It is the pride of people who know that they live somewhere most of the world could not, and who have developed around that knowledge a set of cultural practices, aesthetic sensibilities, and community bonds that the cold, paradoxically, has made possible. The Yakiak Festival, the great summer solstice celebration that marks the return of warmth and light with communal dancing, horse racing, kumis drinking, and rituals that connect modern Saka identity to ancient spiritual traditions, is experienced with an intensity of joy that is inseparable from the length and depth of the winter it follows. The warmth of July in Yakutsk, where temperatures can reach 30 degrees Celsius, an 80-degree swing from the January average, is not just pleasant, it is a vindication. The Saka language, which belongs to the Turkic family and is spoken by roughly 500,000 people, has survived Soviet-era pressures toward Russification with more vitality than many indigenous languages of comparable community size, and its survival is itself a form of cultural cold resistance, the capacity to maintain coherence and continuity under conditions of external pressure that would have dissolved a less cohesive community. The language carries within it the vocabulary of the cold, dozens of specific terms for different types of snow, ice, cold, frost, that constitute a knowledge system in linguistic form, encoding in the structure of the language itself the centuries of close observation that allowed the Saka to survive and thrive in the coldest inhabited place on Earth. Nothing about life in modern Yakutia has become easy, but it has become different, layered, complex, the product of traditional knowledge and Soviet infrastructure and post-Soviet adaptation and the gathering emergency of climate change, all pressing on each other in a city that sits on frozen ground that is, degree by imperceptible degree, becoming less frozen. The cold remains. The people remain. The negotiation continues. The quietest hour of a Yakutian winter night arrives somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, and it arrives with a quality of stillness that has no real equivalent in the temperate world. It is not merely the absence of sound, though it is that too, the cold having suppressed into silence the ambient acoustic texture that warmer environments maintain through insect noise and wind and the movement of water that has not yet frozen. It is something more like the presence of stillness, a positive quality rather than a negative one, as though the cold has organized the darkness into something almost architectural, vast and structured and complete, a cathedral built from the absence of warmth and light that has its own austere magnificence if you are safe enough and warm enough to perceive it as magnificence rather than threat. You are, in our imagining of this night, safe enough. The fire has been tended. The reindeer hides are piled in their careful layered sequence. The Balagan's walls, with their log and clay and manure composite insulation that sounds so unglamorous and performs so remarkably, are holding the worst of the outside world at bay with a passive, patient structural stubbornness that has been doing this work every winter night for as long as the building has stood. The horses in their adjoining shelter breathe in slow, warm rhythms that you can just barely detect as a faint animal presence through the shared wall, their body heat contributing its quiet kilowatt to the thermal commons of the household. The dogs are curled against the sleeping platforms. The fire glows with the steady, low intensity of a properly banked coal bed that knows its job and is doing it without drama. Outside, the temperature is doing what it does in the deepest hours, dropping to whatever the night's minimum will be, the cold pressing down from a sky so clear and so densely starred that the light from the Milky Way casts the faintest of shadows on the snow. The aurora borealis has been moving overhead for hours now, its curtains of green and occasional violet shifting with a slow, liquid grace that suggests intention without quite achieving it, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have existed for much longer than human aesthetic categories and do not require those categories for their continued operation. The light of the aurora touches the snow with a color that has no name in most languages and that the Saka have several words for, none of which translate without loss into anything that conveys the specific quality of that cold, dancing, ancient illumination. The journey we have taken tonight through this frozen world has been, in its way, a journey through the full depth of what it means to be human in extreme conditions. Not a diminished humanity, not a humanity stripped to bare survival, but a humanity that has organized itself with extraordinary sophistication and creativity around the fundamental challenge of staying alive in the coldest inhabited place on Earth. We began with the numbers, the -71, the world records, the statistics that lose their meaning without sensory context. And we have moved through the architecture of survival, the engineering of warmth, the science of clothing and food and sleep, the spiritual and ecological framework within which all of that practical ingenuity is embedded, and the modern layering of Soviet history and contemporary challenge over the ancient foundations of Saka life. What emerges from all of it, if you let it settle rather than cataloging it, is something that feels like a particular quality of attention. The Saka relationship with the cold is characterized above all by attentiveness, the continuous, practiced, multi-generational attention to the thermal state of every system that stands between the human community and the fatal cold outside. The fire, the clothing, the food stores, the sleeping arrangement, the spiritual state of the landscape and the community's relationship with the forces that animate it. None of these systems can be set and forgotten. All of them require ongoing monitoring, adjustment, and care. The Saka did not conquer the cold. They did not defeat it or tame it or make it irrelevant. They learned to pay attention to it with a thoroughness and a continuity that allowed them to coexist with it, which is a different kind of mastery, and in some ways a more impressive one. The balagan around you is settling into its nighttime sounds. Logs shift in the fire with soft percussion. The structure itself ticks and creaks as the outer surfaces cool and the wood contracts in response to temperature changes that the insulation is slowing but not stopping. These sounds are familiar. The household has been falling asleep to them for as long as anyone can remember, and the body learns, over time, to hear them as reassurance rather than alarm. The creak of a log in a well-built balagan is not the sound of something failing. It is the sound of something working, materials responding to their environment with the flexibility that good construction allows for, absorbing stress rather than accumulating it to the point of fracture. The children have been deeply asleep for hours, their young bodies dropping quickly into the restorative depths of sleep that children achieve with an ease that adults gradually lose and spend the rest of their lives attempting to recover. They are warm enough in their position closest to the fire, their small forms nested in the softest of the reindeer hides, breathing with the slow regularity of complete unconsciousness. The adults sleep more lightly, the particular light sleep of people who carry responsibility, who are in some portion of their awareness always monitoring the fire, always registering the temperature of the room, always available to be roused by the small sounds that indicate something requiring attention. This is not insomnia. It is a form of distributed vigilance that the community has developed because the alternative, the deep, oblivious sleep of complete security, is a luxury that the environment does not consistently permit. There is something in this light, monitoring sleep that connects to the broader Sokka relationship with the night as a time of spiritual activity and potential danger. The Abihi are most active in the darkest hours. The boundaries between the living world and the spirit world are most permeable when the light is gone and the cold is at its deepest. The Oyun's work is most demanding and most necessary when the community is at its most physically vulnerable. Asleep, cold, dependent on the continuing performance of their fire and their clothing and their walls. Sleeping lightly in this context is not a failure of relaxation. It is a form of guardianship. The firekeeper adds the last log of the night, a large piece of larch, dense and slow burning, selected for its staying power rather than its immediate heat output, and arranges it against the coal bed with the practiced economy of someone who has learned that every piece of wood is a decision and every decision about wood has downstream consequences for the household's warmth. The log catches slowly, its outer surface charring and insulating the interior, beginning the long, patient combustion that will carry the household through to dawn. The firekeeper watches for a moment, confirming that the catch is solid, that the smoke is drawing correctly, that the configuration will sustain, and then returns to the sleeping furs with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. Outside, a raven, roosting in a large tree 50 meters from the settlement, adjusts its position slightly, pulling its feet up into its breast feathers where they are warmed by the body's core heat, and settles back into the light. Alert sleep of a bird that does not hibernate and does not migrate and simply continues, through the -50 darkness, being alive with the matter-of-fact persistence that has characterized corvids for tens of millions of years. The wolverine has passed through the area an hour ago, following its own logic across the frozen landscape, leaving a trail of prints in the powder snow that the cold has preserved with such fidelity that they look freshly made. The horses breathe. The stars burn with their cold, clear, extraordinary light. The aurora shifts its curtains with the slow patience of something that has been doing this since long before there were eyes to see it. And you, in your warm room, in your comfortable bed, with your regulated temperature and your soft blanket and your complete freedom from the immediate requirements of survival, you are drifting now. The weight of the night is settling over you the way the reindeer hides settle over a sleeping Sokka family, with a gentle, insistent pressure that is the physical sensation of being held. The story of Yakutia has moved through you the way a long journey moves through a traveler, not as a series of facts to be retained but as a landscape to be inhabited briefly and carried afterward as a kind of expanded sense of what the world contains and what humans are capable of within it. The cold is real. The darkness is real. The fire is real, and the clothing, and the food, and the sleeping arrangement, and the raven in the larch tree, and the aurora overhead, and the permafrost 1,500 meters deep beneath everything. The The Saka people are real, 300,000 of them, and their ancestors before them, and the accumulated knowledge they carry in their language and their practices and their relationship with a landscape that has shaped them as thoroughly as they have shaped it. But right now, none of that requires your active attention. Right now, the only thing that requires anything of you is this: the slow, easy release of the day's accumulated wakefulness, the gradual loosening of the thoughts that have been keeping you company through the evening, the deepening of breath that signals the beginning of sleep. The fire glows in Oymyakon. The stars burn overhead. The cold holds its ancient, patient vigil outside every wall and window and door, and inside, the warmth, imperfect, hard one, collectively maintained, sufficient, does what warmth has always done in the coldest inhabited place on earth. It holds. It holds, and the night deepens, and the breathing slows, and the distance between you and the whisper of the stars grows comfortable and then vast, and then it is simply sleep, just sleep, the oldest and most reliable of all the ways that living things restore themselves for another day of being alive in whatever world they happen to inhabit. Let the aurora move overhead without you for a while. Let the ravens and the wolverines and the Yakutian horses do their quiet, cold, extraordinary work in the dark. Let the fire tend itself for these last few hours before dawn, as it has learned to do across centuries of being trusted with the most important work there is. You are warm. You are safe. You are, for now, exactly where you need to be. The cold can wait until morning. Good night.